Okay, let's dive into one of the most heated topics out there, migration and border enforcement. Now, we're not here to pick a side or to argue. We're here to understand. We're going to follow the logic of our current approach, see how it actually works on the ground, and what kind of system it ends up creating.
Just hearing these words, you can feel the tension, right? This is usually the point where the conversation just completely breaks down. People dig in, they question each other's motives, and we stop talking about how systems work and start talking about which side we're on. So we're going to do something a little different. We're just going to hit the pause button. Let's slow it all down. No finger pointing, no easy answers. We're just going to take a careful look at how we got here.
And that means we have to start with the most fundamental question of all. When we talk about cracking down on migration, what is the specific problem we are trying to fix? Because, how you define the problem completely shapes the solution you come up with.
So, first things first, we've got to get beyond the usual shouting match. Before we can even start to analyze the solution, we have to get clear on the problem we're actually trying to solve.
So what is it we're really worried about? Is it as simple as people crossing a line on a map without asking? Is it the pressure on schools and hospitals, competition for jobs? Or maybe it's something a little deeper, a feeling of losing control? Or is the real worry the awful exploitation and trafficking of vulnerable people? Here's the key. These are all totally different problems, and when we just lump them all together, we end up with policies that don't really solve any of them.
So when things feel uncontrolled, what's our first, almost gut-level reaction? Well, we tend to follow a pretty familiar playbook, don't we? Step 1, you tighten the rules. Step 2, you ramp up enforcement. And Step 3, you just try to make the whole journey harder and more miserable. The logic underneath it all is pretty simple. If it's not working, it's because our walls just aren't high enough yet. And you can absolutely see the appeal here. It feels strong. It feels decisive. It gives everyone the impression that we are finally taking back control of the situation. But we have to look past how it feels and ask a tougher question. What are the actual results? What has this approach really produced? What kind of system has it created, maybe without us even intending to? And this brings us right to the core idea of this explainer, the creation of what we can call shadow systems. So, what's a shadow system? Well, think of it as a network of middlemen and black markets that just naturally springs up when you try to block the legal path for something that people are determined to do anyway. In this case, move. We often talk about trafficking as if it's the cause of the problem, but it's probably more accurate to see it as a consequence, a market that emerges to fill a demand that the official system won't. In a perfect world, the legal routes for migration are safe and orderly. They work. But the reality is that those official channels are often incredibly narrow, painfully slow, super expensive, or sometimes they're just shut down entirely. And it's in that gap between the ideal and the reality that this shadow system really takes root and grows. And this sets off a kind of chain reaction. When the legal routes shrink, human movement doesn't just stop. It adapts. People find another way. And that's when the intermediaries, the smugglers, the traffickers show up. And here's the crucial part. The more we clamp down, the more power these criminal networks get.
And that leads us to this really strange paradox. Policies that are designed to be tough on migration can actually end up making desperate people more dependent on the very criminal gangs we say we want to stop. The harsher the enforcement, the more valuable and profitable the illegal routes become, which just empowers the people who control them.
So, what are the real-world consequences of this shadow system? Who actually ends up paying the price?
Well, one thing becomes crystal clear. The risk is not shared equally, not even close. If you have money and resources, you can hire legal help, you can navigate the bureaucracy, you can move safely. But if you don't have those things, you get pushed into the shadow system. Your only options are dangerous journeys, relying on smugglers, and accepting exploitation, which forces you to hide from the authorities instead of seeking their protection.
This ends up creating a shadow workforce. Think about it. If people are living under the constant threat of being deported, they become incredibly easy to underpay and almost impossible to protect. They can't complain about unsafe working conditions, and who does that benefit? Unscrupulous employers. It can even undermine labor standards and depress wages for everybody. And then, the ultimate irony is we blame the migrants for the very conditions our system pushed them into.
And the financial costs, they don't just disappear, they just move. We end up spending a fortune on border enforcement and detention centers, sure. But then we also end up paying for all the downstream effects, endless legal appeals, emergency room visits for people who are hurt or sick, and massive strain on social services. We treat each of these like a separate crisis, but we often fail to trace them back to the system that helped create them.
So if the approach we're using just keeps creating these dangerous and expensive shadow systems, well, maybe we're starting with the wrong question entirely.
For so long, the question has been, how do we stop people from moving? But what if we shifted our goal? What if we asked a different question? Like, what kind of policies would actually reduce exploitation, minimize harm, and lower the long-term cost for everyone? You see, just changing the question opens up a whole new set of possible answers.
And let's be really clear about something. This is not an argument for open borders. Borders matter, rules matter, enforcement has a role. The point is that pretending we can just switch off human movement with punishment alone doesn't actually lead to order. It leads to shadow systems.
Okay, let's zoom out for the final piece of this puzzle. Because this isn't just about migration. It's about a much bigger pattern in how we often try to solve complex problems.
We see this exact same dynamic play out in other big debates, like the war on drugs or the criminalization of sex work. It often starts with a moral panic, which leads to a policy that's all about punishment. And the result? A dangerous black market that ends up concentrating the absolute worst of the harm on the most vulnerable people involved. It's a pattern we see over and over again.
And that leaves us with one last really big question to think about. If our enforcement-heavy approach to really complex issues like drugs, sex work, and migration consistently breaks in such similar ways, if it keeps creating more harm than it prevents, what does that tell us about our whole philosophy of making laws in the first place?